What's up everyone, welcome to the Commander Theorem. I'm your host Paul, and we're here today to help you dive into the Commander format. Building your first Commander deck can be a daunting task. With so many cards to choose from, it can be intimidating to find the perfect 99. We're here today to help you refine your craft, so sit back, relax, and let's explore a Simic Commander today. Meet Ezuri, Claw of Progress, a 3/3 elf warrior for 2 mana of any color, then a green and a blue. As a bit of a backstory, Ezuri was once a fearless renegade fighter on the plane of Mirrodin until the Phyrexians captured and completed him. He is now a weapon of the Phyrexians and a pretty powerful commander. Unlike his former self, this Ezuri is all about bringing power of Phyrexia to our other creatures. Whenever a weaker creature enters the battlefield with 2 or less power, you get an experience counter. And at the beginning of combat on each of your turns, you can put up X +1/+1 counters on a target creature you control, where X is the number of experience counters you have. And as a quick side note, experience counters are a unique type of counter that go onto a player rather than on a creature. And so even if Ezuri should die or return to the command zone, you retain all the experience counters you've gained. The build we have today features a very aggressive take on a +1/+1 counter strategy. Our deck features a very low to the ground approach with a very low curve that aims to get a ton of smaller creatures into play to really churn out those experience counters as quickly as we can. We then can use all those creatures powered up by Ezuri's counter generation to blast through our opponent's defenses. We're also running a small suite of combos in this deck that have the ability to go infinite, but we'll get into that later. Let's start breaking this deck down by covering the ramp portion of our spellbook. Our deck wants to start revving up as soon as possible, so getting those extra lands into play is a great strategy to run with early game. Cultivate and Rampant Growth are classic includes, letting us search out a basic land or two to get us our forests early, or a key island to get our mana fixed. Nature's Lore and Skyshroud Claim both search out forest cards, and do note that these don't necessarily have to be basic forests, so our non-basic forests are fair game. Commander Sphere is great for fixing our mana early game, and once our mana engine is online, we can then sack the Sphere to draw a card. We can also do this once we've tapped it for mana, so be sure to get the most value out of this card before you sacrifice it. Simic Signet is a great little mana rock. For 1 mana of any color, you can generate both a green and a blue mana. Thought Vessel comes as a basic mana rock, but also carries the nifty ability that gives us no maximum hand size, making it doubly useful to get out early game. Our deck will be wanting to draw a lot of cards, as we will see in just a bit, so this is an ability we will want in spades. Birds of Paradise can generate 1 mana of any color, and it also has flying, making it a pretty good contender to soak up Ezuri's +1/+1 counters with its keen evasion ability. Coilin Oracle lets us reveal the top card of our library and put it into play if it's a land. If it isn't a land, we simply draw the card anyway. Also, play close attention as the majority of our creatures in this deck are either 1/1s or 2/2 creatures, and these all will trigger Ezuri and give us an experience counter. Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves are our basic mana dork creatures. Gyre Sage is a bit more advanced in how much mana it can produce. The more +1/+1 counters that we can put on the Gyre Sage, the more green mana we'll generate. Incubation Druid is in the same ballpark as the Gyre Sage. It has the ability to tap for a mana of any color that a land you control would produce, which in this case is green and blue. But should it have a counter on it, it'll produce 3 mana of that color instead. Marwyn the Nurturer is similar in scope to the Gyre Sage, though the generation that Marwyn is simply determined through her power, so it's less dependent on those +1/+1 counters. Rishkar Pima Renegade has a unique ability that he makes every creature with a counter on it into a mana dork for 1 green mana. This can be especially useful as we can generate a ton of mana if we're generous with our counter distribution. Sakura Tribe Elder can sack itself to go for a basic land to enter play tapped, and the Solemn Simulacrum can snag a land and draw us a card when it enters the field and dies respectively. Thrasios is a powerful engine of card draw, scry, and mana ramp all on a 2 mana creature. He's also a powerful commander in his own right, but for what this deck is going for, he functions more effectively as part of the 99 in our ramp package. Wood Elves rounds out our ramp by snagging us a forest. Like the Nature's Lore and the Skyshroud Claim, this forest does not have to be a basic land, and we can go for non-basic forests. We also run a good family of creatures that are small in order to trigger Ezuri, but they have abilities that will grow more and more dangerous as they grow. Cephalid Constable is a favorite of mine in this deck, and is a potential win condition. This unassuming 1/1 will bounce permanents back to their owner's hand equal to the amount of combat damage it deals. This can completely blow out a player, as this can bounce lands and other permanents, leaving them completely defenseless and forced to rebuild from scratch. Build up enough counters and this can be the biggest danger to opponents. Champion of Lambholt gets a counter on it every time a creature enters their battlefield. Creatures that have lesser power than the champion can't block creatures you control. This is great to have out to get a few counters on, making your team more and more difficult to block. Chasm Skulker gets a counter on it with each card we draw, and then when it dies, we get a number of 1/1 Island Walking Squids equal to the number of counters on the Skulker. Cold Ice Selkie not only has Island Walk, a powerful evasion ability, but whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we'll draw that many cards. Edric Spymaster Trest incentivizes opponents to not go after you, giving card draw to any creature's controller who damages an opponent. So we can draw cards off of our creatures hitting our opponents, and our opponents can draw cards off of hitting each other. Fathom Mage has Evolve, which gives it a counter with each creature that enters the battlefield that has larger power or toughness than she does. We can also draw a card whenever a counter is placed on the mage, making her a great target to dump many counters onto. Forgotten Ancient can stockpile counters with each spell that's cast, and then we can transfer those counters onto any creature we'd like. Managorger Hydra gets bigger with each spell cast, just like the Forgotten Ancient, but it has Trample, making it effective to bash through opponents' defenses. Master Biomancer is somewhat a non-bow at this deck, usually buffing our board up to a point that Ezuri will not trigger, but we can dump counters onto the Biomancer to have our creatures come in with even more counters on them. Toothy gets a counter whenever we draw a card, and then when it dies, we'll draw a card for each counter that it had. So now that we've started to accumulate those experience counters, it's time to put them to work. So let's see how we can close out the game with this deck. Perhaps one of the most well-known combos with Ezuri Claw of Progress is the Sage of Hours. This 1/1 wizard can help us completely dominate the endgame, as once we've hit 5 or more experience counters with Ezuri, we can then go off. The Sage of Hours' ability requires we remove all +1/+1 counters from him, and then for each 5 we remove, we take an additional turn after this one. So if we can hit 5 counters, which isn't too difficult, we can go infinite with extra turns. Another combo with this deck comes in the form of 2 cards, Arcane Adaptation and Turntimber Ranger. Arcane Adaptation can make all of our creatures into a type of our choosing. For this instance, we'll choose Ally. We do so because when the Turntimber Ranger enters the battlefield, or whenever another ally creature enters the battlefield, we can then create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. And if we do, a +1/+1 counter gets put on the Ranger. Now, since the Arcane Adaptation makes all of our creatures into allies, the Turntimber Ranger's ability will trigger whenever a new wolf ally enters the battlefield. Also, do note that every single one of these creatures is also a 2-power creature, which should Ezuri be in play, we will gain experience counters for them. This is a great way to end the game, as you will have far more wolves than our opponents can handle, let alone the absurdly strong Ranger. We also want to note that with this combo, this is not an uncontrolled infinite loop, which would normally end the game in a draw, because we can choose whether or not we want to make that wolf ally token. The next combo is perhaps the newest, and is the most primed to buff up the power level and spiky speed of this deck. Simic Ascendancy is a 2-drop enchantment that you can pay 3 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Whenever 1 or more counters are put onto a creature you control, you can then put the same number of growth counters onto the Simic Ascendancy. At the beginning of your upkeep, if the enchantment has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. This is a very potent win condition that will put a very short clock on the game, just in spite of how many counters we can churn out in a single turn. So one of the aspects I put the most emphasis on in this build was the card draw and tutor engine. We will want to close out the game quickly, so rushing through our library for the crucial cards we need has a high priority. Beast Whisperer lets us draw a card whenever we play a creature spell. The aforementioned Cold Ice Selkie draws us cards equal to the amount of combat damage we deal with her, which, given how quickly Ezuri can buff her up, can be a lot of card draw. Edric also lets us draw cards when we damage our opponents, and doubles as a nice deterrent to our opponents attacking us. Fathom Mage draws us a card whenever a counter is placed on her, making her a great target for counter placement. Loyal Drake is a 2/2 with flying, which will also trigger Ezuri's experience ability. It'll also draw us a card at the beginning of combat on our turn should we control our commander. Muldrifter is a 2/2 with flying, which will also trigger with Ezuri's ability, and while we can technically cast it for 5 mana, we can also cast it for its evoke cost, which is 2 and a blue, but immediately after it enters the battlefield, we will have to sacrifice it. We will still draw 2 off of its enter the battlefield ability, and it will still trigger Ezuri. Prime Speaker Vanavar isn't quite a card draw spell, but it can help tutor for the perfect creature to answer the situation we are in. We can trade in a creature to get something with a CMC 1 higher than the sacrificed creature, letting us cruise up our mana curve without expending additional mana. She also is a 2-power creature, so she'll get a counter with Ezuri. The aforementioned Toothy lets us draw a card whenever we put a counter on him, and when he dies, we'll draw an additional amount of cards equal to the amount of counters that were on him. Vedalken Aether Mage looks relatively awkward in this deck, being more at home in a Sliver tribal deck with this ability. However, we are running it for the wizard cycling ability. Lets us snag whatever wizard creature we need, whether it's the Prime Speaker Vanavar or the game-ending Sage of Hours. Wall of Blossoms draws us a card when it enters the battlefield, and it triggers Ezuri. Rhystic Study is a staple blue card include, letting us draw a card whenever an opponent casts a spell unless they're willing to pay an additional mana. Sylvan Library lets us draw an additional 2 cards each draw step, but we have to choose if we want to pay 4 life for each card to keep them or to return them to the top of the library. Brainstorm lets you draw 3, but you have to return 2 cards from your hand back to the top of your library after. Inspiring Call lets you draw a card for each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it you control, and then all those creatures become indestructible until end of turn. This is a great protection against board wipes, and it can help us draw a lot of cards. Bring to Light is a unique add-in, letting us tutor for a creature, an instant, or a sorcery card that has a CMC equal to or less than the number of colors of mana used to cast it. Since we are only in 2 colors, we can tutor for a 2-drop or a 1-drop card. This is great to bring out the Sage of Hours, and best yet, you'll then cast the tutored for card for free. Green Sun Zenith can tutor for any green creature, and then shuffles back into the deck to be used again later. Ponder and Preordain both let us draw a card, and both allow us to possibly flush away some unneeded dead draws before doing so. Birthing Pod is a non-creature version of Vanavar, letting us trade in our creatures for slightly larger ones. This is great to help us bring out some of the bigger creatures without having to expend mana. Since Birthing Pod features Phyrexian green mana, we can choose to instead pay 2 life for that 1 mana requirement. So now that the main spellbook is out of the way, let's talk about our mana base. We've already discussed in detail some of the mana dorks within the deck that can produce mana, but to get those out, we'll need some lands. Since we're only in 2 colors, green and blue, our mana base is relatively simple. I'm not a fan of the original dual lands in commander decks, as I don't see why we need to spend an arm or a leg for a single card, while a shock land, like Breeding Pool, is just as effective. For fixing mana lands, Botanical Sanctum, Command Tower, Flooded Grove, Hinterland Harbor, Simic Growth Chamber, Temple of Mystery, and the Yavimaya Coast all can provide both green and blue mana. The Alchemist's Refuge can tap after we pay a blue and a green to let us cast non-land cards as though they had flash this turn. Think of it as a Vedalken Orrery on a land. It can also tap for a colorless. Dryad Arbor is a land creature and a forest, so cards like Wood Elves can tutor it out. It does suffer from summoning sickness, so we cannot tap for mana the turn we play it. Novigen, the Heart of Progress, can tap for a colorless, but for a blue and a green, we can then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield this turn. This is great when we get our engine rolling and churn out half a dozen creatures, perhaps while Simic Ascendancy is in play. Oran Reef the Vastwood can tap for a green similar to the Novigen. We can tap it to put a counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. Reliquary Tower gives us no maximum hand size, making it effective when our card draw is online. And lastly, Rogue's Passage can make a target creature unblockable this turn. This is especially effective when we have a mighty creature that can deal a lethal blow to our opponent. That's going to wrap up this video. Are you a fan of Ezuri Claw of Progress? Let's discuss this deck further in the comments section below. Who's your favorite commander? Let me know and maybe you'll see them in an upcoming video. You can support this channel by subscribing and ringing that little bell icon, liking and sharing our videos, or you can help support our Patreon. You can also grab yourself a sweet Planeswalker Project playmat over at Inked Gaming. Really appreciate your time hanging out with me discussing this sweet deck you all rock, and as always, I'll catch you guys, gals, and NB pals next time.
Summer in the hills, those hazy days I do remember. We were running still, had the whole world at our feet, watching seasons change.